This episode is sponsored by Koyeb.com. Link in the description. Koyeb is a developer-friendly serverless platform to deploy apps globally. Stick around till the end to hear more. It's back to school time. This is Cup of Go for September 1st, 2023. Keep up to date with the important happenings in the Go community in just 15 minutes per week, or a little bit longer sometimes. I'm Jonathan Hall.
Like today.
And
I'm Shai Nachman.
We're back from holiday. It's good to see you, Shai.
It's good to talk to y'all, and specifically you, Jonathan.
Shucks.
Yeah, it's been a long month. I've enjoyed my time off with my kid, and I hope everybody used the last gasps of summer. Go to the beach or do some fun stuff. Apparently, for some people, the fun stuff for vacation means working on Go, because we have so much news to talk about.
We do. And it's not just quick news items. They're like multiple page blog posts, and many of them. So thanks, Go team, for keeping busy.
Yeah, well, I was at the beach basically daily. You know, I saw Bill Kennedy commenting on the summer vibes.
Oh, yeah? What did
he wrote on Twitter, like, he thought that the Twitter algorithm changed because he has a really fresh timeline with a ton of stuff, sharing cool stuff about Golang. Mm-hmm. And I was like, it might just be all the parents that took vacation and, their kids are asleep right now and they don't want to open work Slack, so they're working on open source Go stuff.
Yeah. On that topic, this is a good time to shout out that the channel, the podcast, is also on Mastodon. So if you're a Fediverse user, you can follow us there too. And honestly, I get a lot more engagement there than I do on Twitter with half as many followers. So it's their algorithm is definitely different and better for me, at least, whatever that means.
Yeah, I'll switch at some point.
I haven't switched. I have both.
Done. That's even worse.
To be clear.
I want less apps, I want less things. All right, how about we talk about Go?
Let's talk about Go.
All right. We have a pre-announcement for minor releases. This is like the urgent news part of the program. Go 1.21.1 and 1.20.8 are going to be released on Wednesday, September 6th. And they cover 3 CVEs. So I guess we'll know next week exactly what's going to be fixed and how the library will be more secure. Just remember on Wednesday to upgrade if you're if you're using 120 or 121.
And if you're using 119 or older, it's a good time to update to 120 at least, if at all possible.
Yeah, the security promises for go for this release, like the current release, and the one previous. Mm-hmm. If you're 2, 3, 4 versions behind, there's no security promise for you. And also, the tooling has gotten so much better, it's worth the switch. It's definitely worth it, especially from a cost perspective with PGO in the new versions. Like, there's a lot of good reasons where, like, there's a really good case for you to upgrade, even though the 121 upgrade was kind of rough around the edges for some people because of the init issue.
Yes.
Did you manage to fix that?
I did, but I don't know how. So I had a seg fault happening. I just went in and started cleaning up a bunch of init, and eventually it started working again. So I don't know exactly what caused the fault, the failure.
That's actually hilarious.
Yeah,
all right.
It wasn't my ideal. I was hoping to narrow it down and figure out what the problem was. But
while you have your calendars open, marking Wednesday to upgrade, what else should they mark on their calendars?
I think you should mark September 26 to 29, especially if you're in the San Diego area, because that's when the big GopherCon will be happening. We have a bunch of friends of the show going to be there too, so shout out to everybody there representing Cup of Go when in our absence for us.
Yeah, we'll look for stickers and like or cups.
Yeah, awesome.
On the topic of conferences, EU GopherCon was a while ago, and the videos are now live. So if you missed it, like me, couldn't go. Now you can make up the talks and in half the time because you can watch them on X2, which is a great feature that it sucks it doesn't exist in real life.
Yeah.
There's a ton of great talks in the link. We want to shout out specifically Go Sync or Go Home about like advanced concurrency techniques. It's a great talk by Yarden Leifenfeld, which was here on the show a while ago. Shout out Yarden, your talk is awesome. I watched it. It's really good. All right. So we talked releases, we talked conferences. Now let's talk about the language. And we have a ton to talk about. And the first thing we're going to say, yes, there is the HashiCorp business license, open source available. I don't know even how to call it, scandal.
Issue.
Elephant. There's the BSL elephant in the room right now.
I've spoken to 2 different people who work at HashiCorp, and they are completely tight-lipped, as expected. We know that they're not allowed to talk about it. Only a few select people in PR are allowed to talk about that from the corporate perspective. But that doesn't stop.
We're going to say 2 things. In case you haven't heard about it, HashiCorp are no longer open source. They're source available, which means a ton of infrastructure that's also written in Go, and a ton of companies and a ton of people, a ton of companies are suddenly worried.
Yeah.
And the second thing we're going to say is that we're going to talk about it soon. We have too much to cover in today's episode, and we want to talk to more people, maybe from HashiCorp, maybe from OpenTF, and try to understand. We want to give you a more nuanced take about it. So we're going to talk about it in the future, not today. Let's talk about Go, finally. So obviously, talking about Go, we're going to talk about HTTP servers, right? That's the only thing the language is good for.
That's all it does, HTTP. So we have several things to talk about here. Probably the first one, which kind of kicks off the whole topic, is something we talked about a few episodes ago, which was 3 years ago now, I think?
Feels like it.
It was a proposal to add enhanced routing to the standard library's servmux. Basically, you could put a verb in front of your path and it would do magical things for you. I won't go into all the details because we just talked about it before, but it has been accepted. So the standard library's router will be much more powerful, sort of obviating the need for that capability in many of the other third-party routers. So that's nice. Which leads right into a discussion that I've had. Actually, it's on Reddit, but I had the exact same discussion with other people on Slack last week as well. The sort of standard question, which framework should I use to build my web app? Or is the standard library really enough? This is kind of a controversial thing. The sort of knee-jerk reaction to what's the best framework is none. Is that really good advice? It's advice I've given before, but is it really good advice? So there's a nice Reddit discussion about that. If you've ever been sort of slapped with that answer as well, and you don't like it, 2 things. 1, you're not alone. There's a lot of support for you. And 2, that answer is becoming less of a bad answer very soon with this new accepted proposal.
Yeah, one person on the channel about a month ago, Jamie, shout out Jamie Tana, he mentioned Gorilla versus this new servmux in the STD, where, if this proposal goes through, there was a question of, is Gorilla going to be on the rise again because it was recently unarchived, or is it going to slowly die down because of the STD lib? And, I think that there's some sort of, I don't even know if it's a misconception, just an idea that if something is in the STD lib, it's good and it's strong and it doesn't need financial support because it got there. You can trust it. I know I definitely feel a lot more comfortable, using standard library things than third party, where I have to start worrying about, should I set up a Patreon with the maintainers to make sure that this critical infrastructure for me is going to work. And putting it in the STD lib is a really, really good move. And I really want to see all the tutorials get rewritten, with edit at the top. Oh, now you can just import it from the standard library. You don't need all these third-party packages. And also the third-party packages replacing their internals. If you want to stay with Gorilla's API or, use things that work with it, like API generators and stuff like that, just their internals being replaced with calls to the standard library, it's going to be a lot better, a lot more efficient. Really happy to see it happening. Obviously, as usual, the discussion in Reddit is a lot more inflammatory that we had to take it down 10 notches. But go to the standard library is becoming more and more solid advice.
I think there's still room for improvement. And I mentioned this in the previous episode, especially with error handling for HTTP handlers. But I think there's room to improve the standard library further. And there are other pieces that are missing from a traditional framework, such as binding to your HTML template rendering, all this stuff. But this is a really big and important step towards that ideal of just use the standard library.
And if we're already talking about just using the standard library, there's a great discussion going on. Like that segue, I ordered the news items correctly.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's a discussion going on GitHub about putting metrics in the standard library. There is already runtime/metrics, which gives you access to just detailed information about Go runtime, stuff like memory and stuff like that, which is useful. It is useful for application developers now and then, right? You want to monitor how fast your memory is growing and then decide on how many threads to put in the thread pool accordingly, and not just have Kubernetes manage it for you with killing and raising pods. You want to do it slightly more elegantly or whatever. These things have been proven to be useful. And someone asked JBA, Jonathan Amsterdam, Jonathan Amsterdam. That's not going to be confusing to anyone.
No.
No relation to me, Jonathan in Amsterdam.
Exactly.
Coming to you from Amsterdam. So he just raised a really nice question. Runtime metrics exposes a lot of detailed information about Go runtime. What other packages in the stdlib need their own metrics? And it would be useful to know about their internal state. And the first obvious answer is net HTTP, right? Mm-hmm. Basically, everything you do once you set up a production server is set up Prometheus next to it with all the metrics and connect it and write all the counters and whatever. Why shouldn't it be in the stdlib? This is a pretty new discussion, so we encourage you to go visit it. The last comment there, I think, is really, really good. It's someone from the Prometheus team, right? So I'm going to sort of murder their name. Bartlomiej Plotka. I hope I said that right. He's he wants to help and he wants to add it to the standard library. It makes sense from the Prometheus team to be totally on top of it. It's currently just a discussion, not even a proposal. So it's a really good time to, put in your 2 cents, or if you think it's relevant for any other stdlib.
Yeah, if you've ever thought, or if you've ever had to implement your own metrics for some part of the standard library, this would be a great place to go mention that.
And I have a question for you.
Yeah.
What library least needs metrics? What library would you never need to know what's going on internally at all? I'm thinking maybe text marshalling, but number of bytes and how fast. It's really hard to think about someplace where metrics wouldn't be useful.
Yeah.
Oh, crypto. That would be bad because you could do side channel attacks.
Maybe. Although still, I could see them being useful.
Just for the evil people. Anyway, so there's a discussion on metrics in the stdlib that's coming right on the tail of, standard servers, stronger routers for servers in the standard library. And the standard library is just getting better and better and better. That's great. Go contribute.
But I love those Go puns. That one wasn't even intentional.
Yeah, I was just, I wasn't even going for it. All right, there's one more proposal we wanted to discuss about IOFS.
Yeah, so this one we mentioned a few months ago, I think. There's been this long-standing proposal to extend the fs.fs interface, which was added in Go 1.16. So I think this proposal is almost as old as that is. The idea was to make it to extend it with writability. And we talked about it a few months ago when Russ Cox sort of did a shout out to the community. Hey, we're looking for more use cases for this to try to come to a standard that we can agree on. Unfortunately, I guess, depending on your view, this has been declined for now. It's not necessarily permanently declined, but the conclusion is that there's just too many edge cases to come up with a useful abstraction that won't hurt somebody. So it's better right now to implement your own that's application specific if you need this sort of thing. But there's potential to reopen this issue in a year or two after we've had some more experience, particularly with the new extension of generic support and the way we're doing some of these things. Maybe we'll come up with a more useful general purpose abstraction that would make sense to put in the standard library.
I love that result. I think it's very fortunate. This is a very, I actually need it for this and that scenario. If the community will converge on one huge open source interface that we can all agree on in practice, in reality, it serves 80% of the people, it's not good enough for the standard library, but it is good enough for these people. Yeah. And that's just a really good state of being for everyone. Not everything has to go into standardized interfaces, especially if the standard isn't very useful, but will just hamper you or, actually building a foot gun, right?
So I think it might be worth mentioning why this is just a really simple example of why this is so complicated, because it sounds pretty obvious. Why not just add a write interface or write file method to your interface, right? It sounds really simple. But then when you start to consider things like, what happens if the file already exists? Should you clobber it? Should you return an error? What should you do? And then you can say, well, pass a mode flag, which is what the file system does, right? But not every implementation supports a mode, and not every implementation supports the same types of modes. So, what if you're writing to an S3 bucket or to your actual file system, or you're sending an HTTP request? There's 1,000 different ways that this interface could be implemented, and you can't really abstract that simple concept of what do I do if the file's already there. There's just not a simple way to do that. So
let me give you an example.
Yeah.
We mentioned Liri Sokol's GopherCon talk on the way she implemented the virtual file system over Git. She could clobbering a file there literally translate to a git commit under the hood.
Yeah.
It's going to be hard to define an interface that communicates that well and also works just for my normal hard drive.
Yeah. So that's a really simple example. There are much more complicated examples of why it's difficult related to file permissions and different types of file systems and all sorts of stuff. But just to give you a glimpse as to why it's complicated, I think that's enough of an example for the show.
When did you last call, directly write out a call for the Win32 API?
Never.
I
don't do Windows programming.
So you're missing out. First of all, they all end with A or W. Right, so you have
for
write file
appender,
A.
Right? Okay.
No, for ANSI versus Unicode.
Oh,
obviously ANSI versus wide. So A and W, and then you have 32 parameters. I'm exaggerating, but write file, for example, has 5 parameters, which is already kind of difficult.
Yeah. 3
in parameters, 1 out parameter, and 1 in-out optional parameter. And that's how it actually works when you have to define the low-level interface.
So the last time I wrote code in Windows was in Windows 3.1. I was writing some C code that was only for DOS anyway. Unless you count the WSL work I did, I wrote some Fallout 4 scripting stuff in Linux in Windows, but I don't think that counts.
I don't think that counts as well. And that's obviously the easy write file function, not the write file X function. Writing is hard.
Exactly.
Files are difficult. And Windows sucks. These are just facts. Sorry for any Microsoft. Satya, if you're listening and you want to sponsor us, this was just a joke, right? All right. So we talked about a ton of stuff already. We really tried to keep the show short enough so you can, you're probably already parking your car / tying up your bike, or, you just finished the dishes. So we're going to cut off here. We have a ton more to talk about, like we said, the HashiCorp thing, forward and backward compatibility, tool dependencies, PGO updates, something I'm super excited about, reproducible builds. We're going to talk about it soon. I don't even want to commit to next week because the community is just abuzz with activity. We have really fun updates for the ad break. And after that, we're going to go into a deep dive into slog. So we are going to continue with news. We're going to talk a lot about the new slog package. What do you need to know? What are some ancillary packages you should learn about? And how John has been using it to refactor some old code.
Good.
So stick around.
See you soon.
This episode is sponsored by Koyab.com, our beautiful returning partners. Shout out to Yana and Alice there specifically. We love y'all. What is Koyab, you might be asking? Jonathan, do you have code?
Yeah, sometimes.
You write it on your machine, and that's the construct. But what about the artifact? Where do you put the artifact? Where do you put the binary? Where do you put the containers?
I usually just upload it to the dark web and let everybody deploy it however they want to.
Yeah, I usually mark it as miners, as crypto miners, and then eventually it will run on one of my clients' PCs. Exactly. But now there's a better way. Koyab is a developer-friendly serverless platform to deploy apps globally. No ops, and I'm running 2 servers there, and I'm not an ops person. It's literally no ops, no servers, no infrastructure management. You can do web apps, you can do APIs. That's what I'm doing. I'm hosting 2 backends there. You can do event-driven serverless stuff if you have ETLs you're trying to run, background workers, which we're going to dive into a bit more, and even cron jobs. I've been a happily paying user. I haven't been paying a lot because they're pretty cheap. Don't raise my rates, guys, but you're giving me great value.
Do they have a free tier I can use if I just want to try it out?
Yeah, $5 a month, and you can host 2 nano servers there. That's great for POCing stuff. And it's honestly so easy to just, grab your GitHub repository or your container and set it up. They've been working super hard during the summer. It feels like they didn't take a vacation because they released a ton of new stuff. One thing, and we're going to put this link in the description so you can go check it out, is, high performance background jobs with Koyab workers. So they've been working on it for a while, but now it's generally available. And you can do some pretty beefy workloads. I'm running, tiny servers that are mostly for educational purposes. But they provide up to 64 virtual CPUs and 64 gigabytes of RAM per worker with high-end CPUs. So especially if you're writing Go, if you're doing Python work, maybe you need all these resources. But if you're doing Go, you're probably good. It's even coming to a place near you. They have 4 new locations in early access. So if you're in Tokyo or in Paris, look for server farms. Maybe Koyab is one rack there. So it's super easy. Go read the blog post if you want to start playing around with it. And, tell them we sent you. They might give you a good deal. Thanks again, Koyeb, for returning. We're really happy to have you as a partner.
And of course, the easiest way to tell them that we sent you is to click the link in the show description. So
yeah, because it has a thing, the UTM source. Yeah, it says coming from Jonathan from the dark web.
Exactly.
Cool. So we've been also working hard during the summer vacation to come up with cool new merch for y'all.
Yeah.
And by working hard, I mean I literally took 5 minutes and listened to one of our beautiful listeners, Jay Morelli. Thanks, Jay, for contributing, who asked for a different cup. So now we have a new version of the coffee mug, which is a bit more minimalist, doesn't have text, and the gopher itself doesn't have text on, and the tiny ghost on the cup. It's all more nuanced. I actually think it looks better, and I'm sort of sad that, Jay has that and I have the old one. If you want it, you can go to store.cupago.dev and grab one for yourself and your partner. So go buy some merch and support the show. We wanted to share some analytics with you as well. We know people love that, the numbers game. What's going on?
So we had a record-breaking episode last episode. Now, I think part of that's because we've had a break, so any new listeners are just jumping straight to that one. But just the same, we hit a record. We had well over 1,000 downloads of the last episode, which narrowly beats out the second place runner, which was back in June. We had one with about 30 fewer downloads. But that's great. It's good to have new people listening. If you're listening new, give us a shout out. Come join us on the Cup of Go Slack channel on the Gopher Slack. We'd love to hear from you there. How did you hear about the show? What do you enjoy? What could we do to improve the show? We'd love to hear all of that from you.
Yeah, hate mail. Specifically, we're looking for hate mail. We need someone to bring us down a little bit, And if you're not a Slack aficionado, you can also email us at news@cupago.dev. That is news@cupago.dev. And if you don't have anything interesting to say to us, but you do want to support the show, leaving a review on Spotify, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you check your podcasts, wherever you pod your casts, that's a good way to support the show. And maybe share it, send a link to a friend, coworker, or co-student.
And tweet and toot about us on Twitter and Mastodon. If you follow us there, we send out automatic notifications for every new episode. Just hit the retweet or the retoot. I can't remember what it's called on Mastodon.
It's not retweet, it's re-X now. It's like repost.
Yeah, I'm never going to say that.
Yeah. Sorry, Elon. Maybe if you sponsor us, we're going to accept the X rebrand. All right, so that's it for the ad break. Thank you all for listening. Thanks again for our beautiful partners at Koyeb for sponsoring the show. We really, really appreciate it. And all the nice stuff we said about them is true. We vetted it. I use it. It's not just because they sponsor us.
We would never lie. Not for the amount of money they sponsor us for anyway.
Yeah, it's not like it's not like a huge deal.
If Elon wants to come on, we might consider lying for him.
Definitely. So thank you all for listening and stick around for a discussion about slog. All right. I have someone very interesting on the interview today. Did we manage to get him on the call? Because I don't see him joining. He sent us a text with his details. Did you get that?
No.
Oh, I didn't parse it correctly. Gosh darn it, these textuals, non-standard formats. Jonathan, how about you tell me about something that can save me from trying to parse non-standard textual formats?
I need something that will save us from corny segues.
Maybe you can bring Adelina back on.
All right. Today we're going to talk about slog because it's one of the biggest features added to Go since ever. And of course, one of the biggest features added to Go 1.21. And there's a great blog post about it from the Go team. So if you haven't already read it or aren't already intimately familiar with slog, highly recommend you go check out go.dev/blog/slog. It's a nice little...
By the confusingly named Jonathan Amsterdam, no relation.
Yeah, no relation. But it's really just an intro to the slog package. It talks a little bit about the history of how it was designed, the design process behind it, how it's designed to be performant, and of course, how to use it at a very high level. It doesn't go into a lot of details, just sort of how to consume it. But the TLDR, if you've been living under a rock for the last 6 months and haven't been paying attention or haven't ever listened to the show, Go 1.21 added a new package to the standard library called log/slog. The S stands for structured. So this is structured logging. Structured logging, if you're not familiar with that, is the idea of logs that have sort of key value pairs rather than just being a long string of text that has to be parsed, as Shai was talking about in our little segue there. Mm-hmm. And there have been many packages in Go by third parties to do this. Logrus is probably the first popular one. There's Zap and ZeroLog and a whole bunch of different other ones.
GoKit/log.
Yeah. There's a bunch of different packages that do essentially the same sort of thing, but they all have different APIs and different strengths and weaknesses. Some are more API friendly, some are like a human readable API, some are more performance oriented that maybe leads to a more cumbersome API. But now we have it in the standard library.
I want to talk about the motivation, other than the funny segment. So I want to share a bug that I've experienced specifically with structured logging, or perhaps the lack of structured logging.
Okay. Yeah.
I had an Nginx server in production.
Was that the bug?
Yes. And the standard logging format for things that go into Nginx, like if you don't touch the config, is textual. It's not JSON. What ended up happening is every now and again, and that would drive us absolutely bonkers, the 503 HTTP error alarm on our system would go up. And in my previous company, we really cared about uptime. It's a security company. We really didn't want the system to be down. And we would get these random 503s and we just wouldn't understand why. We would go through the logs. We would go through our traces. We would go to Datadog. We would go through everything. And we just couldn't figure out why. And we looked at the Nginx logs and it did say 503, no problem. If you ever looked at the Nginx logs, they have the HTTP code, then bytes read, then bytes written. And the alarm went off, the alert went off on the bytes written. If accidentally the request was 503 bytes, 503 bytes, or the response size, it would raise the alert.
Nice.
And, this is a simple, the most basic example of this was structured and I knew what field to look for. And it was easy for me to parse, then this bug wouldn't have gone on. And, this woke me up on weekends. I started investigating. I'll probably find something, but I never found the root cause.
I'm going to start sending requests to that endpoint with foo equals 503 just to trigger your alerts.
We set up a test where we sent a payload the size of 503 once a day to make sure that we didn't have any regressions in the alert. But this is a super classic example, right? The default output is not structured. And then when you have to use it, and that's the point. It shouldn't be easier to write these logs, but it should be a hell of a lot easier to consume them and actually make useful stuff out of them because they're structured.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're using a tool like Kibana or any of the common popular log tools, you can do searches on a particular field very easily. So many listeners are already familiar with that. But if you're not, if you're accustomed to grepping server logs, those days need to be in your past.
You can still grep JSON. You're not losing
if you want to.
any.
Yeah, right.
By the way, slog doesn't even enforce JSON. Maybe we should go into how the package looks and how you can use it. So it's very easy. Import log/slog and, go to the blog post that John mentioned and we have in the show notes.
Yeah.
And, it won't print JSON by default, but I assume almost anyone who's going to use this package is going to use the JSON handler, which also comes built in with the package, slog.new JSON handler.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So the handlers, right? So the way this package is designed, it's a two-part system. You have the sort of front end of slog, which is what you use as somebody producing logs. And then you have a handler, and you can choose an arbitrary handler. There's two by default, the text handler and the JSON handler. And you can create your own. I've created one. And we'll talk about some others in a moment. So by default, it uses the text handler, which produces output that looks very much like the standard log package's output. And it doesn't really give you the benefits of structured logging, but it is human readable, which is kind of its main benefit. So I think a typical use case would be to use the text output for debugging on your local development machine, but JSON handler for your actual production servers where things go to get ingested into Kibana or whatever.
Or if you have, a package that is used both in CLI context, on the back end. On the back end, you want it to output JSON, but usually in the terminal, people would prefer to have the human readable output because it's human on the other side of the screen, usually.
Exactly. So this is two parts. You have the sort of front end, slog logger, and then you have the back end, slog handler, and you can create your own handlers. Now, one thing that's not in the standard library, but is relatively easy to do, is you could create a handler that wraps multiple handlers. And so this is where I want to talk about a third-party package that I've been using. It's actually a collection of third-party packages. If you go to github.com/Samber, you need an entry point here. I guess I'll say slog-sentry, although he has almost 24 different handlers. Maybe a better one is the example I'm talking about. github.com/Samber/slog-multi, which lets you group multiple handlers in different ways. A very common way would be, say, you want to create text output to standard output or standard error, and JSON output to send to your log ingester, and maybe you also want to do syslog or whatever. You could group 1 or 2 or 3 or 25 different handlers into a single handler so that when you call slog.info, it goes to all the different appropriate places. This package I just mentioned from Samber is one of many that he's provided backends for a bunch of different common logging systems, Graylog, Slack, if you want to send your logs to Slack, Mattermost, Microsoft Teams, generic webhook one, and some middlewares for common web frameworks, Gin, Echo, Fiber. So there's a nice collection of slog handlers and middlewares here, and we'll have a link to all of those in the show notes, so you can check those out too.
Well, we're not going to have a link to all of those because they're like 20.
We'll have a link to one of them, and from there you can get to all of them.
I think the one that's interesting is, first of all, the one that's funny, the one that's just objectively hilarious that's there is slog Parquet. Just immediately putting your logs into like data format, object storage that only analytics things are going to read. But the way it's set up is pretty interesting is because, of this really elegant design, this like 2-part epoxy glue of there's the interface and there's the handlers. It enabled people like Samber here to set up pretty complicated design workflows with logging, stuff that you actually need. Fan out, pipelining, routing them, failovers, and even load balancing if you want to, save on bandwidth or like manage the bandwidth, I guess.
Yeah.
So you can use all these backends through like an entry point he's calling slog multi, which, you set up, let's say, a JSON handler and a text handler. You can set them up in a fan out like architecture using slog multi. So it feels like it's a complete package already. You can do anything you want. And this is a super new addition to the standard library. Yeah. People have been really like hungry for it, I guess, if you already have a Microsoft Teams slog handler set up. So nice work, Samber.
So I think it's worth talking a little bit about why bother with this, considering that we already had packages like Zap and ZeroLog and Logris and all these other ones. And the blog post we mentioned does talk about that a little bit. And one of the strongest arguments for this is to come up with a standard. And I think that's really important. It's not that these other ones were bad or didn't do their job correctly, but when you have competing standards like this, it's really hard to write a third-party package that can accept a meaningful logger. So you had a lot of packages that would just take their own logger interface that maybe just does something really simple. And then it's up to you to interface that with your logger implementation. Hopefully now we'll start to see better support because now any third-party package that needs a logger of some sort can just accept an slog.logger and it will just work. It'll use the right log levels and so on.
Do you think the third-party libraries will, in future releases, conform to this new interface as well? Like you'll have stdlib conformant, let's say, Logris interface or GoKit Logger, because I feel like they've been really entrenched. At least my experience with GoKit is they worked so hard on their interface, even though it's really simple. It took a while to whittle it down to perfection.
I'm glad you asked, because I actually just this morning filed an issue with Logris, which is a library I've used frequently, and I've actually committed a few changes to them. So I just submitted an issue asking for this capability and offering to write it, because I've actually had to write it for a client that I'm working on right now that has been using Logris very poorly, which is one other point I want to talk about. Why would I bother switching if I'm already using Logris? And the answer in this case is because it was done so poorly in the first place, it needs to be redone anyway. So I might as well redo it with slog.
Just to clarify, you mean the first time you used logs, you did it incorrectly, not that Logris is bad, right?
Right. And not that I did it, but I inherited this code base, and it was just the logging is done terribly.
Of course, Jonathan.
Yeah. I never
Any
make
code you
like
touch
that.
is golden.
Exactly. But I think that's a valid point. If you have an application that's already using Logos or Zap or ZeroLog and it's working, you probably don't need to make this change. I mean, that's a really intrusive change to your code base just to be standards compliant. I wouldn't suggest doing that. Instead, I would suggest using a compatibility shim so that ZeroLog or whatever can interface with third-party libraries that use slog in the future.
Yeah, one interesting feature with slog that we'll mention just in brief is that there's a proposal to slog tests. So there is already like testing / slog test, right? If I need to test like my handlers, more correctly, if I want to add a test handler, I can use this package. This does have an open proposal right now for supporting subtests. And it seems like a likely accept from 2 days ago. So this is the final comment period. You can go look at it and say, to make sure that the new handler and t-skip and like all these run with options and all these things work nicely together. But it's an interesting question always. Testing and logging in general, it's always an inflammatory, when you're super young, you're either not testing at all or you're testing everything, like you're too much or too little. And one thing that I found really useful in tests is, yes, adding logging to tests, but not testing the output of the logger. When you have structured logging, you can test for, the fields that will always be there, and just to make sure that these ones are correct. Or even just output, only if the test fails, output the logger info. So it'll be easier to trace and understand what happened and why the test failed. So there are a few good use cases for logging with testing, and it's good to see that we didn't just release it out the door. Now we're done. Looks like people are working on the second order effects of, this new package as well.
Is there anything else that you think we should talk about with regard to slog, or have we covered the important bits?
I think the most important thing is just to really encourage you, even if you're not going to replace your entire logging in all your projects from the beginning of time to slog, to try it out. In your next project, you'll want to use it. In the next Go file you open, you might consider using it. So I guess it's not something worth discussing, more like a call to action. I know, at least for myself, for my to-do, next time I'm writing Go, I'm going to do slog and not like my logger or any of the third libraries. Because now that it's landed and it's released, it's going to be good to know it as, it's good to know IO, or it's good to know tests, or it's good to know like any STD Go feature. It's going to come out useful. And, after being burned myself with structured logging, you don't have to do the same mistake and jump on 503s just because that's the number of bytes written. God damn it, Nginx.
Awesome.
Cool. We'll be back in your ears next week.
Yep.
Thanks a ton for listening. It's super fun to come back. I miss you, Jonathan.
Yeah, me too. See you next week. Bye.
See you next week, everyone.